All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our April program. We have an awesome speaker tonight, Joe Silvera. But before we get into the presentation, wanted to give a couple updates and ask about sightings. So first, I'll open it up. Any special sightings recently? I saw a whole bunch of tricolored blackbirds because that's what I've been up to the last few days. And Karen and Lois and many others here and many other awesome volunteers and AltaCal members. So thanks everyone for helping out with the statewide survey. And we saw several breeding colonies. Actually, really good news. Last year, 3 years ago, it's only every 3 years. I don't recall if we saw any active colonies, but yeah, we saw one in southern Tehama County, northern Glen, right at the border, and some Himalaya blackberry, about 4,000 tricolors were observed. Huge colony, relatively speaking. You know, they said historically, like flocks of 100,000. 100,000 would be in a colony. That would be a huge colony. And then like 20,000 was like, that's big. And now like 5,000 is like really substantial colony. So their population is declining and they need habitat. You know, it's really interesting. Their nesting substrate was Himalaya blackberry in the colony I observed. But they'll also use tule and bulrush and cattails and even thistles, believe it or not. Bull thistle, milk thistle, those are nesting substrates that they'll use as they're breeding. And so yeah, we also saw some in Tehama County and some near south of Chico, north of Oroville, the Dove Ridge. So the tricolors are here and they're breeding, and we'll be seeing more of them as the year goes on. All right, so for our program tonight, Joe Silvera is going to be presenting on the soil landscape and floodplain habitat restoration, because the soil landscape creates recognizable large to fine scale patterns on the land, often expressed in the vegetation that covers the soil geologic landforms. And so he's going to talk about Llano Seco. Llano Seco is a really interesting site to study this because a lot of the valley's been flattened, but the Llano Seco area was really it maintained some of its natural topography. So Joe's going to be talking about all of that. And Joe attended CSU Chico and to get his bachelor's degree, and then CSU Fresno for a master's in biology, and is a certified wildlife biologist. Spent 36 years working in natural resources conservation, including UC Davis Cackling Goose Project and Snow and Ross's Goose Projects, as well as at our very own local Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge. So let's give it up for Joe Silvera.
Thanks, Garrett. And so why are soil landscapes important? They're important because they affect vegetation, which is habitat, and thus the distribution of the critters that we are interested in. I'm going to be using Llano Seco for a couple case studies, and we have a couple federal properties on Llano Seco, one that's attributed to the Sacramento River National Wildlife Refuge, and another to the North Central Valley Wildlife Management Area. We're known for waterfowl. This is a big deal at the refuge. The very first refuges were established by the Lee Act, which provided funding to create refuges to alleviate crop depredation that waterfowl were causing to the local farmers. But we also provide habitat for numerous endangered species, federal and state. Not surprising, because we have some of the last vestiges of natural habitat valley. And we also provide plant habitat. So we have a lot of interesting endemic plants, especially in the Butte Basin and the alkali soils, Delvin, Colusa, and Sacramento refuges. So we do habitat restoration. We restore wetlands on the floodplain. Floodplains considered temporary wetlands. We also restore grasslands, associated marshes, and also vernal pool habitats. But how do we do that? You know, I mean, how do we figure out where to put these habitats? Oftentimes it's because it's the only spot left, but that might not always give you the desired results. So we don't have a time machine, but we do have these old soil surveys. And the pointer doesn't work, but this outlines the Butte Basin refuges. Llano Seco up here, the Butte Basin and the Sutter bypass down there. And this old soil surveys shows you that surprisingly, the Llano Basin refuges were grasslands, but also these large vernal pools, intermittent lakes. The marshes were associated with Butte Sink and the Sutter bypass, or excuse me, the Sutter Basin. And so we have vegetation types that are associated with landforms, like low floodplains, high floodplains, the basin rim. And we can think of these habitats occurring on the landscape on landforms, such as flood basins, Sacramento River floodplain, young fans, tributary fans, older fans, high terraces, all the way up to the foothills. And those landforms are associated with geological formations. These formations are tilted 30 degrees with the lift of the Sierra Nevada. And those geological formations are important because they provide the parent material to develop soils. So you'll have soils that are associated with certain geological formations. And it's kind of neat. If you have the soil web app on your phone, you can tell what soil you're on anywhere in the planet. Then you can drill down into the descriptions and you'll know what landform you're on.
Like a web soil survey?
Yeah, it's really handy. So I first got into recognizing the importance of soils down in Merced County. If you look at this aerial photo just for an instant, you'll recognize that there's like a couple patterns going on here. There's kind of a northeast to south west, oh, excuse me, northwest to southeast trending pattern on the land. And these are aeolian deposits and aeolian blowouts. And then there's these mottled looking features, and that's alkali soil. So what you're looking at is the young alluvial fan blowing on top of basin rim soils, and the basin rim is just above the floodplain. So that's where you have your alkali tolerant plants, for example. So I thought it was really neat because I've circled that area, and there's 3 major soil associations that occur there. And what intrigued me about that is that the coast tidy tips, I'll use common plant names, the coast tidy tips would track on the sandy soils of the fan, whereas the Fremont's tidy tips would track on the heavy clay soils of the basin rim, especially the Rossi Joaquina soils. And then if you looked at the alkali soils, Douglas pagogeny would track on the Lewis-Landlow-Burchell Association, whereas Sacramento Mesa Mint, pagogeny, I forget it now, Sacramento, Zizophryoides would track on the really super alkali soil in the purple. And I thought, man, I don't even need to be a botanist. I can read the soil survey polygon and I can impress people by knowing which pagogeny we're looking at. But it really got me to thinking about the importance of soils and plants. And then later, Bob Holland published some work with vernal pools that he did in eastern Merced County, and also he was working in eastern Sacramento County. And he found that these landforms, these older landforms, like the Laguna Formation, next to the Merton Formation, they'd each have vernal pools, and they could just be a few yards away, but the pools would have totally different distinct floras. Yet Laguna Formation pools in eastern Merced County would have a similar flora as the Laguna Formation pools in eastern Sacramento County. That really blew my mind. I thought, yeah, these plants are really tracking soils quite well. And so that happens on a kind of the mid scale. And on a really fine scale, this is like the soils of kind of vernal pool. You can get different flowers germinating based on the properties of soils in that micro scale. So how is that useful? Well, Tom Griggs and his associates down in the Tulare Basin were mapping out the remnant vegetation, the remnant natural habitats of the Tulare Basin, and there weren't very many. And the vegetation map at the time by Kugler showed 4 distinct plant communities. I think it was like tules and mesquite and oak trees and needlegrass. But so what Tom did and his colleagues, they looked at the remaining soil polygons that supported a natural vegetation, and they extrapolated that vegetation to the full extent of those soil polygons. And so they filled in this wonderful, diverse vegetation of the Tulare Basin. Introducing Llano Seco Rancho, a historic land grant. It's under conservation by Fish and Wildlife Service fee title, Upper Butte Basin, and then along the Sacramento River National Wildlife Refuge. Nature Conservancy has easement, so does the Northern California Land Trust, and Fish and Game has some fee title as well. And so it's a relatively intact, well, it's the last Mexican land grant in California. Conservation broke it up, but it kind of saved it because it kept it from becoming small farms and small duck clubs. And it's relatively intact compared to the surrounding landscape. If you take a look at Google Earth, you'll see what I'm talking about. So it's a great place to study soils and vegetation. So we were fortunate enough to have a soil survey office open in Chico, probably around 1992, 93. And they were charged with describing the soils in this diverse county. And so they came up with a detailed soil survey. And we were fortunate enough to have them work on the refuge. Federal entities usually have to pay, but we didn't because we made a deal that I wrote their wildlife section and then for the Butte County Soil Survey, and they came out. And so you can see Llano Seco with the circle around it. There's floodplain soils and flood basin soils. So you got river floodplain and then the basin, and there's a total of 6 different associations with many different soil series. So there's Andrew Conlon in the pit, describing the evolution of the planet. But what he's really doing is he's describing the soil properties and putting together the soil survey mapping unit. So you probably can't see it, but the black and white map has all these little numbers transcribed onto it, encompassing in the center of a polygon of a similar single soil. And so what we did, a group of us got together, Tom and Dean and I, and we decided to see if we could identify the vegetation that's unique to these different soil features. And so what we found is we have the modern floodplain, meandering floodplain, light green. Dark green is the prehistoric Sacramento River before it started meandering. It was an anastomosing, braided channels. There's an uplifted basin here that doesn't flood. And those there's terrace remnants, cinnamon colored stuff, and then the basin rims, the lighter cinnamon, and then the flood basin is shown in dark brown at the edge. And so if I flew over these landscapes, and they each look so distinct. You can see the meandering floodplain, that's the active channel. And then right next to the high floodplain, the high floodplain is 500 years old. The active channel, the oldest oxbow is, the oldest oxbow on the active floodplain is 500 years old. The high floodplain is 5,000 years old. So Angel Slough is the Sacramento River before there was a meandering river. And so what is now the Sacramento River floodplain was the Stony Creek fan. And there's a lot of Stony Creek cobbles out in that part of the modern floodplain. And then you have the basin, uplifted basin, the basin rim a little bit higher than the flood basin. And you can look at these different soil mapping units. That's I think that's the third column, and you can relate it to the floodplain position and the hydrologic features. But the really cool thing is you can take those soil mapping units and determine the vegetation, remnant vegetation that's on it, and the structure of it, typical plants, and then the wildlife that's associated with it. And I think that's the way you approach a restoration. Rather than say, hey, let's make some habitat for a chat. Well, you can't just make chat habitat anywhere. It pretty much has to be like in appropriate soil types. Here, this example at Llano Seco, which would be the oxbows. It would be the oldest portions of the active floodplain, rather than going out to the basin, and putting in some wetland feature that they probably wouldn't use. And that's just more of that table that has a complete array of the soils from the floodplain all the way down to the basin. And so this is an example of the active floodplain. Once again, this is the west side of Llano Seco, about in the center. Provides habitat for neotropical migratory birds. And there's this, on the oxbows, that's pretty still water, provides habitat for wood ducks, for example. Seeing the chat out there, song sparrows. And in some parts of the active floodplain, where it's kind of open, you'll get like sand deposition or silt deposition. And if it's sand, you'll get a growth of telegraph weed. If it's more silty, like big stands of artemisia. Artemisia, mugwort. Mugwort. Yeah, and so on the riparian part of the channel, the river's edge, you'll have a succession of like sandbar to willow trees to cottonwoods, and you'll have some herbland interspersed. But this part of the floodplain, or part of the floodplain, is characterized by a moving lateral migrating channel. It creates cut banks and point bars. Cut banks are important for the swallows, obviously, and the point bars for plant succession, beginning with willows. The high floodplain, on the other hand, it floods, but not as deeply and not as prolonged. But there are channels that stay flooded for quite a long time and create habitat for wintering waterfowl. This is the north end of Llano Seco. So it's characterized by oak trees and Santa Barbara sedge, for example, creeping wildrye. Swainson's hawks nest in this environment because they like nesting in the trees and hunting in the open plains. So I've seen as many as like 4 territories on Llano Seco. This illustrates the active channel. Right along here, you see these little meander scrolls, and then here's the paleo channel, that 5,000-year-old channel. This is Llano Seco, and there's a point where the modern channel, Eddy Lake, comes in direct contact with the paleo channel, Angel Slough, and that doesn't happen anywhere else in the world because it's all been cultivated. The channel, the paleo channel, like created like 15 feet to 18 feet of topsoil, no rocks. It was really hard to age. They had to use some fancy equipment to age that floodplain. But that's kind of a superlative to have this intact. Above Llano Seco, those channels are all farmed, and so are they too below Llano Seco. So it's a special place. And associated with those older channels, especially on the eastern edge, where they come into contact with the heavier soils, clay soils, you have floodplain meadow habitat. And this was described by Tom Griggs. We were cruising along Llano Seco, and hey, look there's California loosestrife, there's mint, stackies, there's milkweed, iris leaf sedge, and he's found similar habitat on the San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge at one site. And we also have it on Calusa and Sutter National Wildlife Refuge in Clear Lake Clay. Pretty cool stuff. Those are great native plants. And this is from Calusa National Wildlife Refuge in the floodplain meadow there. And then finally, the remnant fan terraces and uplifted basin. That's where you'd have grasslands and vernal pools. The vernal pool habitat occurs where you can get some overland flooding, but the water has to come down before the growing season. Otherwise, it becomes an emergent marsh. And that's where we do have emergent marshes and where we build emergent marshes from former rice fields. So this is near 7 Mile Lane, and wildlife viewing platform is in this photograph. So this is just a soil triangle that shows you the particle size, the grain sizes of the different soils. And it's kind of color coded. So you can see that, the basin, that there are going to be finer textured soils, and the river would be like bigger grain sizes, loams, sandy loams. And so it's kind of neat at Llano Seco where you have, all this variety, so you can look at it at one location that has a similar site history. So here's another. So when you're looking at these patterns, they can occur at large scales, like the succession of the different kinds of forests, like willows to cottonwoods to oaks in the background, to really fine scale, like what's happening around the edge of a vernal pool. And so one more look at this Llano Seco soil landscape. These different colors represent soil association, soil groups that are very similar. So we'll look at like some examples of how you use soils in habitat restoration. So the Sacramento River National Wildlife Refuge was established to provide habitat for migratory birds and endangered species, restore floodplain habitats. And there's a picture, those pictures on the right-hand side, the middle one shows plants being put into the ground and protected by milk cartons. And you can see an older restored forest in the background on the bottom image, and a just planted forest, gonna be forest, in the foreground. And that's at Phelan Island. So related to soil, backing up, when we decided to restore the refuge, it came at a time when refuges were doing comprehensive conservation plans. And it's kind of I thought that was a good thing because it gave you a blueprint for how to manage a refuge. And that was great because if you had a new manager come in, they couldn't change things. You had consistency. And so we used a landscape approach to restoring habitat. In other words, we looked at the hydrology and the soils and the geology, plant materials, local plant materials, and obviously the economic impacts. But we like to use local ecotypes because over half the plant lives in the soil. And if you want restoration success, you want to plant a seed, a propagule, that's going to germinate and survive. Otherwise, you'll just open up spaces for weeds. So we started the woody restoration in 1989 and collected willow cuttings and cottonwood cuttings locally, collected acorns locally, and then other plant materials, collected the seeds and grew them out in containers. And then 10 years later, we started growing out native grasses. We tried to use as local as we could for the ecotypes. We've got our plant materials at hedgerow farms. Now we have, locally, we have River Partners has heritage growers in Grimes, just near Calusa. And I think heritage growers is the natural evolution, so to speak, of hedgerow farms, because the originator of hedgerow farms is no longer with us, but he handpicked Pat Reynolds, who is managing heritage growers. And I feel like there's real continuity there. That's good for people practicing restoration. So then 10 years after we did grasses, we started doing native wildflowers. And we wanted to use local as we could get for the seed sources, but there's just not a lot of seed sources on the Sacramento River floodplain because it's so converted to agriculture. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. So this middle reach of the river, the Sacramento River curves between reaches 2 and 3. That's Red Bluff to Chico and Chico to Colusa. That's where the river meanders, lateral bank movement. Above, it's incised, and below, it's channelized in some finer soils. This kind of gives you an idea of how the river moves around, and you can see the old meander scrolls and even some oxbows. But the 100-year floodplain is where the river was in the last 100 years and is projected to be in the next 150. So it's really kind of a violent environment where the river takes the bank and just, collapses it, takes the sediment into the channel, and then the sediments are deposited downstream. They're also deposited on the floodplain, and it creates new point bars on the opposite side of the bank. So really starting from primary succession with this kind of habitat. Really important for salmonids and the bank swallow. We're recruiting large woody debris into the channel, which is important habitat for small salmonids. When the floodplain is flooded, it's shallow on the upper flood, it's active floodplain, and the temperatures are warmer. It's really good for the small fish, really good for their growth. And so you have channel meander, and you have plants that are trees and shrubs that are germinating in response to how far they are, their requirements for water in the water table. So you have oaks that are most drought tolerant. They're in the upper portion, and you can see oak trees back away from the Sacramento. We're looking at the Sacramento River channel. We're standing on the Sacramento River channel, looking east, and in the far distance are those oak trees. So that's on higher ground. This is an example of what mixed alluvium is. It's most soils develop over time, and minerals might leach out, creating pans in the soil like clay pans or hard pans over really long periods of time. But this active channel is all mixed up. It's mixed alluvium, and there can be gravel anywhere in the profile, depending on the velocity of the floods at the time. And here you can see sand and silt layers, and the sand dries out at a quicker rate. So if I was a bank swallow, I'd make my burrow in the sand right here. It's more friable, and I'd use the silt as the roof and the ceiling to my burrow in most cases. And this is really compacted silt. So it's a harsh place to do agriculture. And if you look at the photo on the right, that's the Rio Vista unit of the Sacramento River National Wildlife Refuge. And you see these openings. And all that was, planted to trees, but the trees sorted themselves out based on the gravel below. The roots couldn't get past that gravel, and the trees desiccated. That photograph, those openings resemble the openings in the 1933 air photo when it was oak woodland. So soils are really, really important for what can grow where. And so we dig a lot of backhoe pits when we embark on a restoration. Here's, we're looking at silt loam. It really holds together really well. You look at spilling out of the bucket. Compared to gravel, where sand and gravel, where you can see the gravel pebbles on the side of the backhoe pit. You can see the backhoe pit kind of collapsing, and you can see you can just see that it's just really loose. And then, hey, we saw some sedges on the floodplain. This is an old field. Let's dig a backhoe pit there. So what do we find? We find really heavy compacted silts and clays on top of sand. So that could have been like a low hollow historically, where the sediments just sat on the floodplain while all the stuff around drained out. But it's really quite diverse. And when we do a restoration, we have to consider the soils, but we also have to consider the effect of the vegetation on flooding and flood project levees. So our partners, Nature Conservancy and River Partners, work with hydraulic engineers to calculate the roughness of the vegetation we're going to plant and how that'll impact the hydrology, the raising of the water column on the floodplain, and how it might impact the levees. And when we design a restoration project, it's flood neutral. We don't want to change the level of the water on the levees, because obviously we don't want to go over top the levee, but we don't want to change it too much for the benefit, because we'll have downstream impacts then. We'll be sending more water downstream. So flood neutral. And then we collect seeds and propagules from local ecotypes. When we do the site prep, it's got to be kind of scorched earth. Weeds are really bad on the floodplain. They'll overtake your restoration. But they're planted and irrigated with tape for 2 to 3 years. Grasses are planted in between the rows and managed for 2 to 3 years. And and then we've been pretty successful with that approach. So we're at about 12,000 acres of our 18,000 acre approved acreage for the Sacramento River Refuge. And the column on the right shows remnant acres of different habitats, and column on the left shows restored. And it's kind of remarkable, because what we've restored is flood-prone ag land. And including for endangered species like the valley elderberry longhorn beetle, we actually had great success with beetles colonizing our restoration sites. And the native grassland took off, which was pretty remarkable. We're pretty happy about that, because the grasses are displacing weeds. But then we started thinking, well, we need to get more diversity in our grasslands. We only have a palette of about 6 to 8 grasses and sedges, and we need to do something for pollinators. So we embarked on native wildflower restoration. We've selected a number of spring wildflowers and summer wildflowers. And long story short, there are ecotypes of plants that look fairly identical. Like, let's take gum plant, for example. There's a Sacramento River ecotype that grows in sand and gravel. And there's a Butte Basin ecotype that grows in clay, the opposite. But not only that, strongly saline and alkali. And there's a good source of YOLO gumweed at the seed growers. And we tried the YOLO, and it disappeared after quite a few years. We also, River Partners also tried a San Joaquin ecotype of gumweed on a project below Llano Seco. And, it was like a lawn, but it was really kind of short. It was only about 2 to 3 feet tall at most, whereas the San Joaquin ecotype was over 6 feet tall, but it too disappeared. And so, on the other hand, the Sacramento River ecotype is the one wildflower that just keeps increasing over time. So that's John Anderson, who's got a big smile on his face looking at some La Barranca, gum plant. So local ecotypes are important because they assure restoration success, pollinator timing, matchups. You're conserving natural diversity. You're conserving a cryptic diversity, one that you really can't see with your eyes looking at the plant, but it's there because the plants are responding to different soils, different soil environments, probably different soil microbiomes. And so this is happening at a fine scale within the plant. And so we're considering these long evolutionary lineages that are adapted to prove successful through time. And these soil endemics, soil edaphic endemics, are good stress tolerance to hydrology like flooding and soil chemistry like alkali or not. So over 90 research and monitoring projects were done on the Sacramento River from 1992 to 2018. Insects, birds, small mammals, and it showed success. As the age of the restoration increased, the diversity of these different taxa of animals also increased, and there was a spillover, in fact, into the remnant habitats. We were increasing the size of the corridor on the Sacramento River. But, you know, it wasn't perfect because we didn't restore river processes. A lot of the river is confined by rock and by levees. And one of the principal physical process on the river is a migrating channel. And so we got to work on that. And so that takes us to the bank swallow, which is like the original soil surveyor for a wildlife or a critter. They select burrow sites based on the soil texture, and they'll use a burrow for up to 3 years, and then you start to get pests in the burrows, lice and whatnot, and they start to decline. But the population of bank swallows on the Sacramento River has declined while rock has increased. That's what the bottom graph shows. So what to do about that? Well, first of all, you go out and determine what kind of soil you have on the river cut bank and where the range of the burrows fall in that soil. But that's something you can't control. That's, the soil is going to be what it's going to be on the floodplain. But knowing that, we decided we'd take out a private levee at one of our units. And so this is Refuge equipment and operators on the excavator and these big scrapers. We usually use this stuff to make, duck ponds. We used it to take down a levee. And this was at the Flynn unit. And after we took the levee down in 2001, and then we had winter rains in 2001 and 2002, and it went over bank, the bank moved, and that's literally the colony the next summer. It was 2,770 burrows. That was the second largest colony on the river at the time. The largest being the first survey in 1986 at the M&T site that was rocked. So, if you make a duck pond, the ducks come, you take down, some bank revetment and the swallows come. That was kind of cool. But we had a lot of partners, too many to name, for the Sacramento River project, very successful. But now I want to turn to the basin. And Llano Seco means what? Dry plain, yeah. And you think, what are they referring to? Because you got the Sacramento River on the west side, you got the historic channel, Angel Slough down the center, and you got the terminus of Little Chico Creek on the east side, and the whole thing just about goes underwater. The whole thing, but the center portion, this is illustrated here. This is like the boundary of Llano Seco up here. So this is kind of the center portion. This is the bottom of Llano Seco. The color would be this brown right here. And that's the uplifted basin. It's a basin, but it's uplifted geologically, and it never floods. And so you have vernal pools in that kind of terrain. So we turn now to the North Central Valley Wildlife Management Area. You guys are familiar with Sanctuary 2. Our viewing platform is there up in the north end. Track 17, we decided we'd do a vernal pool restoration. Vernal pools are described in regions based on pretty much similar climate, I would say. And generally, is it kind of like the Southern Sierra? Is it Middle Sierra, foothills, Sacramento Valley? Anyway, so Llano Seco is a northeastern valley vernal pool region, Sacramento, and It's the only like vernal pool landscape that's kind of not on the terraces. It's down on this uplifted basin. And so, Llano Seco, we do restoration for, to satisfy flyway management plans, but there's, also for vernal pool recovery. And the neat thing about vernal pool recovery plan is it's the ecosystem recovery plan rather than just, here's a recovery plan for the bald eagle or for the beetle or for the snake. It's the entire suite of vernal pool species in California and Southern Oregon. It's difficult to do species by species recovery. It's bound to fail because you're focusing on one species and then you got to focus on the other. You got to focus on the habitat, and that's what was beautiful about that recovery plan. And of course, there's really cool plants associated with vernal pools. Quite a few endemic species. And then the other thing about Llano Seco is the sandhill cranes. There are 3 subspecies of sandhill cranes that winter in Llano Seco, and these come from distinct breeding areas. And the greater sandhill crane is threatened, and the lesser sandhill crane comes from has the farthest trek to make from western Alaska. But you'll see all 3, including the Canadian. And then, so Llano Seco vernal pools occur naturally as meander scars. You have water coming off of Angel Slough heading to the, and Little Chico Creek heading to the east and blowing out a piece of the topsoil, or scraper cuts that farmers did long ago. And so these are some images of vernal pools at Llano Seco. The summertime image looks pretty bleak, but there's really cool summer flowering plants there like vinegar weed and tarweed. Important for pollinators. Okay, vernal pool soils are clay soils. There's 3 soil series mapping units, and there's subunits within each of these, but heavy soils, heavy clay soils with a calcium carbonate or clay or silty clay durapan, lime cemented. They're vertisols, deep cracking. That means they'll crack from the top when they dry out all the way down to the durapan, that lime silica cemented layer that prevents water from percolating. So track 17 has an interesting history. In 1922, it was contoured rice. And then in 1976, it was, and you can see the contours again in 1952. But in 1976, it was re-leveled for irrigated pasture. And then we took it over in 1991. It hadn't been irrigated for a long time. So, it was just kind of an annual grassland, essentially. And there were some natural pools in track 15 to the north. Oops, backwards, sorry. So the refuge manager always wanted to restore vernal pools. And as a member of the vernal pool recovery team, I thought, we all collectively thought, let's preserve what we got. Let's not, open the door for, we're going to do all this mitigation. But then the more I thought about it, it kind of made sense because we had this soil survey done, and we might give it a shot in an old field that was used for irrigated pasture and dried out. And so we had the benefit of me having done years of large branchiopod fairy shrimp surveys on the refuge and the ranch. And, I can tell you that fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp are in these pools, and in the spring, the ducks really go for them. In fact, I'll never forget on my birthday, I can't remember what year it was, maybe around, it was around 94, 95. I showed up at the ranch manager's office, Llano Seco, stopped in to say hi, and the fairy shrimp were going to be listed. He goes, "Why don't you take me out to see these fairy shrimp, Joe?" So I took him out, and I went out with my little aquarium net and made a few sweeps and came back, and the net was just really full of these fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp. And he said, "I knew these shrimp were out. I knew these ducks were sitting on these pools, and not for wasteful reason, he operated livestock. He was putting weight on livestock. Well, the shrimp were helping to put weight on the ducks. And I learned that the local newspaper phoned him, asked him what he thought about the fairy shrimp being listed, and he said, "The fairy shrimp aren't hurting anybody." He had a mind of his own in a lot of ways, and I thought that was really cool. Anyway, and then we had, so we knew the kind of shrimps in the different pools. We had really cool plants at Llano Seco. Vern Oswald and Lowell Hayhart did a little florula for us. And, the deeper pools had habitat for the shrimp, and the shallower pools had habitat for all these wonderful, like showy wildflowers, vernal pool endemics. And then we had a soil survey that was done for us. So we had everything we needed. That's Andrew Conlon. He sometimes gives really cool field trips for Snow Goose Festival. You'll learn a lot about soils. He's holding a piece of ash I brought back from him from Tule Lake. Ash buried from it was ejected from a prehistoric volcano in the Tulare Basin. It looks like his lab partner's eating a sandwich or something, but anyway, they're into their work. So that's an example of the soil profile of where we're going to be attempting to restore these vernal pools. And there's the description from the soil survey, gives you the depths of the durapan and the flooding frequency and depths of the different soil textures. But our approach was to take natural pools on the ranch, identify those pools, and somehow construct them in track 17, a re-leveled, dried out pasture. And to do this, I got the idea from the soil survey to use a tile probe to map the depth of the durapan. I'll explain that in a second. So we contracted with DU to do the engineering for us, make the plans, and to survey. So they set up a tool station. And this is an example of a tile probe. It's just a metal rod with a handle and a carriage bolt on the opposite end of it. And you can go into any of these vernal pool landscapes when the soil's wet. You don't have to be in the pool. You can be. You can be in the portion around the pool, and you can push it all the way down, and it'll stop when it hits that clay pan. And it doesn't have to be a thick clay pan. It just stops the tile probe penetrating any further. So you can measure the depth of the durapan. So how did we restore these vernal pools? We measured the surface topography of the native natural pools, how deep the pools were, and then we measured from the bottom of the pool to the durapan. Because as I found that the deeper pools had a shallower depth to the durapan, the water was perched longer, and the deeper the soils are from the pool bed to the depth of the durapan, think of it as a sponge. It just soaks up all the water, and hence you have like a shorter hydrology, but it's hydric for sure, and it grows those beautiful little flowers. Anyway, that's the case at Llano Seco. So here we are measuring the depth of the durapan. There's the durapan once again. It's lime silica. And that's what the landscape looks like in summer. But we're out when the grass is green, and it had rained that year, and we're able to push that probe down into the soil. So what we did with AutoCAD, they took those measurements, the surface topography to get the depth of the pool to the bed, and then the bed to the depth of the durapan. Going back here, whoops. Going the wrong way, sorry guys. Bear with me. Bear with me. There we are. So I want to emphasize this. We created 28 stations and took 3 measurements to the depth of the durapan in track 17. And in hindsight, I would have liked to have doubled or tripled the number of stations, because the durapan isn't flat in the bottom. It's wavy. And depending on where you hit, you might get a realistic measurement that reflects what your target pool is or not. And most of the time we hit it just right, but on a couple occasions we didn't. Yeah, okay, good. So we'll go forward here. So we get our measurements and we design our pools. We actually made the pools kind of the same shape as the source pools. We might have stretched one out a bit or curved it a little bit to make it, but we, you know, if you're going to serve these pools, it'd be nice to be able to, you know, reflect on in the field on where what the source pool shape was. Anyway, heavy equipment, refuge equipment, once again, digging out the basins, you know, doing the cuts. And then the ranch had a Trimble mounted GPS, so they did the finish work for us. And these are the as-built plans. These are the final metrics. And this is the final height, the final depths of the pools. And some of them, like this one in the upper left-hand corner, that tan shows how shallow in that kind of tan area that pool was. That's an example. And you can see the really light area. That's probably the Durapan itself that we scraped into a little bit, or it's just below the surface. That's an example of the area where the Durapan came up. And we were off on our measurements because of that. But for the most part, we were very successful. We did 11 pools, 6.6 acres of pools on a 142 acre unit. And how did we do? Well, they ponded in the first year. They didn't pond in 2014 because it was a dry year, but any year it rained, they flooded. And this is an example of, you know, information from our wildlife survey. But we had birds using those vernal pools, like 40 sandhill prunings roosting in vernal pool 5, you know, 20 white fronts at the shoreline, 140 widgeon in vernal pool 11. And that's just when we encountered them on these regular surveys that were done every 2 weeks at a specific time. We could encounter actual ducks like in these pools, like if you went out, just you know, scope out the pools. So they were being used by waterfowl. And we started collecting fairy shrimp out of them. We didn't inoculate the pools with any cysts, but it was about 5 to 7 years after flooding that we ended up with vernal pool tadpole shrimp, vernal pool fairy shrimp, California fairy shrimp, California clam shrimp in 5 of the 11 pools that we constructed. That's a pretty big deal. 2 of them are recovery species. So birds are using them. These are photographs from birds using the pools we constructed at Calusa. You know, in my snow goose talk, field trip, I talk about how various birds like go through their annual cycle here in the winter, and they select certain food items based on their behavioral and physiological needs. And what's really cool is if you're in a place like Llano Seco, it's kind of a microcosm, and you have all these different it's a wetland complex of vernal pools, floodplains, managed marshes, you know, rice fields, managed marshes with different kinds of vegetation. And you can explode this out to the valley. The valley has all these different habitats as well. And birds, you know, they can fly. So if there's fresh habitat from flooding, they'll find it. And this year, the birds weren't very abundant on the refuge because we had a lot of rain in November and December, and the flood basins filled up, and the birds took off. They were looking for fresh sources of nutrition, protein especially, in the later part of the season. But vernal pools get used every time of the year. Like in the summer, there are horned larks out there, lesser nighthawks. I even saw a dove nest at one of the pools in Vina Plains. They call it the safe pool, right there on the bed of the pool. Really important habitats. So we didn't have to inoculate the vernal pools with shrimp. I think the birds probably brought those cysts in, or maybe the cysts were residual in the soil. But we did have to inoculate for a rare vernal pool grass. We decided to give it a shot. This is a project with Colleen Hatfield and graduate student Aaron Gottschalk Fisher. And we chose Green's Tuctoria because it was a very abundant vernal pool grass at Bina Plains, which is in our vernal pool region, the northeastern Sacramento Valley vernal pools. And it's also a really rare grass. It's abundant at Bina, but only occurs like one other place in any great numbers, like in the Modoc Plateau. But it was a project that we did with using seed mats. And you can see the years, the numbers planted, and kind of the outcome. We're still monitoring, and I wouldn't, not jumping up and down. It's a great success, but it's not bad to go out there and find these plants in these very weedy pools. For some reason, the pool flora doesn't recover like the shrimp do. I think the shrimp are really used to just different habitats because the cysts have been dragged around by waterfowl for eons. But these plants might be like soil conditions, like mycorrhizal fungi and other soil microbes that are lacking in the restored pools. Don't know. But we had a lot of good partners for this project once again. And, I've been showing you these slides of wetland restoration. The Sacramento River floodplain, it's a wetland, and vernal pools. These are our project funders. We call this a restoration, and it's like, I call it a habitat resto mod. It's a modified restoration because you can never go back with today's conditions to like historic conditions. We don't have all the physical processes there. There's levees all around the valley. There's roads all over the place. The habitat is so fragmented. But if we're restoring habitat, we're increasing patch size and connectivity, which is a benefit for wildlife populations. And this increases ecosystem health at all scales, at the scale of the patch that you've restored. But as you increase the patch size, there's added benefits. So this is great for biological integrity. And I really like the idea of using local ecotypes and naming the seed sources after the soil. For example, there's a yellow poppy, yellow ecotype poppy, but it's from Yolo County, and Yolo County goes from the valley floor to the foothills. I would rather have it be named after, like, at least the soil association from whence it came. And in doing so, you're protecting cryptic species and long evolutionary lineages, successful lineages of really special taxa, and some of them that are adapted to the soils they're in. So I think that's my presentation. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And we'll take some questions too. If folks have questions, I'll see what's on the Zoom. All right, we got a few in there. Any questions from the room? Yes.
What percentage of our funding came from the federal level? I can't give you a percentage right off the top of my head. I've been retired for like 5 years. But we got our funding from the CVP, Central Valley Project Improvement Act, Bureau of Reclamation. And that was a federal source. We got money from California Waterfowl Association. DU did some in-kind labor for us. And that's for the vernal pools. For the river, some of it came from land and water conservation funds, and some of it came from CVPIA, like one other, that's other species that were impacted, not directly from the taking of the water, but the land that the water irrigated and destroyed the habitat of like beetles and kangaroo rats. So some of that was CVPIA.
What does that acronym stand for?
CVPIA, Central Valley Project Improvement Act. So that was bipartisan legislation that set up funding for recovering species impacted by developing a water project, the Central Valley Water Project. If you talk to like old timers, older than me, I'm 70 now, but I remember talking to the pilot biologist at Tule Lake, Jim Hainline. He is probably 20 years older than me. He remembers driving down, he was a biologist at Tule Lake, but he remembers driving down to Bakersfield on the west side of the valley. Before there was the Central Valley Project or the aqueducts or any of that, there were no orchards out there. It was all kind of wild land. It was grazed by sheep and cattle, and there were duck clubs out there. And that was about it. So, and then when were the water projects put in, like on the east side here, the 55, Shasta Dam went in 39. So, you know, you don't have to go back too far. Well, it's pretty far. You have to go back to the turn of the, into the 20th century. It, like the soil survey photo I first showed you from 1950, they were able to map like all these features that are gone now. And so that's why we're doing resto mods. We're not like really restoring exactly what was there. And we're lucky to have funding for it. So CBPA was a big part of it. I think they also funded research, which is important for monitoring.
So I have a question. Did you see more small mammals?
Somewhat.
More small mammals?
We didn't, you know, we tried monitoring small mammals at one site, and I'm not sure there was troubles with that survey because we were trying to like nest. That's what term to use. We're trying to roll up like bird surveys with small mammal surveys with vegetation surveys, and using the same size plots, and it really didn't work out for the mammals. But they are out there, and we've had actually at least one restoration site wiped out by voles. And that was at the height of the drought. The flooding on the river is really important for maintaining these pests. And, you know, they saw that on the Cosumnes River as well. So that's kind of unfortunate. But they're out there.
We have another question from Patricia Pewterbaugh. What about fire? Was there either historically fire, either introduced by Native Americans or natural sources like from lightning or other sources? Can you speak about the relationship with fire?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was definitely a relationship with cultural burning on the river. A lot of the habitat that we're restoring is on a higher part of the low floodplain, which would have been valley oak trees. And there was a lot of cultural burning done in these oak woodlands to enhance, for example, Santa Barbara sedge that the California Indians use for making baskets, to also enhance habitat for lily family species, you know, to enhance production of corms and bulbs that were used for food. Fire is kind of tricky to use at a restoration site. We have done it in some of the bigger openings, done it a couple times. It takes a lot of prep work because you don't want to burn down your trees. So you have a lot of hard line, you have a lot of crew out there. And we're planting, with all that native grass we planted, it was really important to have some kind of management, because if you don't have flooding, you just end up building up really tall stature plants, and then they just fall over. You build a lot of thatch. We saw like seams open up like seams on a mat, and like species like Kixia fluellen germinate through the cracks. So that's when we go in with a burn. And that was that big grassland out at Pine Creek. That's when we go in with the burn, follow up with some herbicide. But the beautiful thing about like creeping wild rye and purple needlegrass, they're really adapted to disturbance from flooding and fire. We're using an ecotype of purple needlegrass that comes from Llano Seco, Angel Slough, that has a flood history. But fire can be very important, but it can't be applied in all habitats, especially the ones that have like a lot of flashy fuels, small willow trees, whatnot. So we actually use livestock grazing. We would use put cows in after I think 5 years of tree growth, and that helped us out a lot too.
Another question? Oh, sorry. Can we also repeat the questions? Joe, would you mind repeating the question too,
I can do
for
that.
everyone on Zoom?
Sorry. That was natural at that site, but we have.
So she was asking about the
yeah.
monarch butterfly and the milkweed, whether it was natural or planted.
Yeah, you repeat the question.
Sure, happy to.
Yeah, thank you. And so the answer to that question is not the narrowleaf milkweed at that site, at that natural floodplain meadow site, but we did a lot of milkweed planting using showy milkweed, Asclepias speciosa, because that occurs more on the Sacramento River floodplain than the fascicularis, the narrowleaf milkweed. And so both River Partners and Nature Conservancy had like gardens and that they would grow. We collect the seed in the wild, and then they grow it out, and so we planted it like on the Refuge. Yeah.
Any other questions? Colleen Hatfield says, "Thanks, Joe. Great and informative talk."
Thanks, Colleen. Great person to work with.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much,
right.
Joe, for spending your time with us tonight, sharing all this awesome information.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our program, and everyone on Zoom for your participation. Have a good night.